A secret facility in Japan conducted some of the most horrifying experiments in human history. Thousands of men, women, and even children were subjected to unimaginable cruelty, all in the name of science. To make matters even worse, the masterminds behind these atrocities never truly faced justice. Instead, many were granted immunity in exchange for their research. This is the horrifying story of Unit 731. Hi, my name is Tasha, and this is my series White Rabbit, where we deep dive into anything spooky, odd, or just interesting while I apply some special effects makeup. Today's story deserves the biggest trigger warning ever.
Get out of here! Get out!
There is abuse towards women, children, men. This is definitely the worst story that I've done on my channel so far. And although I won't be going the extra mile to be super graphic, a lot of it, there's just no way around it. So if you are sticking around, hold on to your drawers because it gets crazy.
This is straight crazy right here, man.
Today's makeup is from a movie I've actually never seen, or maybe it's just been so long that I barely remember it. But I am turning myself into Pinhead from Hellraiser. I actually asked Google to describe Pinhead's personality, and this is what it said. He is portrayed as a detached, almost emotionless entity that enjoys inflicting pain on those that he encounters. And that is exactly how I would describe one of the main players in today's story. If you like this type of content, please subscribe and help me get to my goal of 1,000 subscribers. I would be forever grateful. Or you can follow me on my other socials. I will have them linked below. And let's get into the story. I'm probably going to butcher some of these names, but forgive me because I'm doing my best, okay? Shiro Ishii was born in Chiyoda, Mura, Japan on June 25th, 1892. Shiro's father was a very wealthy landowner that actually owned almost all of the land that surrounded them. He also manufactured rice wine, so he did very well for himself. Shiro definitely grew up more on the privileged side. He was described as an avid reader and very intelligent. All of his teachers, even his college professors, would talk about this thirst for knowledge that he had. This thirst for knowledge eventually led him to study medicine, which he did very well at. He studied hard and he partied even harder. Shiro was known to have quite a few drinks and party himself right on down to the brothel, spending lots and lots of his parents' money. But by the time he graduated, Shiro had definitely settled down. He got married and he even enlisted in the army as an army surgeon. After his time in the army, Shiro went back to school, this time to study microbiology and human pathology. So he was basically studying disease within the human body. And Shiro became very popular within the medical community. He was extremely hardworking. He was very intelligent. Shiro was always either conducting an experiment or writing a paper. In school, he was always impressing his teachers, and in the army, he was always impressing his superiors. And it is very important to note that Shiro was extremely patriotic. There's a reason Shiro went to the army right after med school when all of his friends went to private practices and hospitals. Shiro was always looking for a way to blend his love for his country with his love for medicine. So one day, Shiro was reading about the Geneva Convention. Now, the Geneva Convention is a set of international treaties, and their whole purpose is to protect civilians during times of war. Now, because during World War I, chemical and biological weapons were used and they caused torturous effects on people, they were strictly prohibited and considered a war crime. I'm just going to tell you about a few of the weapons that were used against people and what they did to people so that you can understand why they were banned. First up is chlorine. Chlorine gas actually reacts with the water in your lungs, and together they form hydrochloric acid. This will destroy lung tissue. It can cause permanent damage and even lead to death. It's estimated that the very first time chlorine was used, over 1,100 people died. Moving on to phosgene. It is highly toxic. It reacts with the protein in the lungs by disrupting the barrier between the oxygen and the blood. So basically it ends up causing suffocation. 85% of all gas deaths in World War I were attributed to phosgene. The most commonly used gas in World War I would be mustard gas. Mustard gas caused chemical burns on the skin, and it would cause these blisters that would be oozing yellow fluid.
Oh, that's nasty.
I know that's gross, but that's what it is. The worst part is that the exposure is symptomless. By the time you start to feel the burning or the irritation on the skin, it's too late. It also caused respiratory problems because you would be inhaling this gas. Those who suffered from the chemical burns and respiratory problems, if they did survive, they were much more likely to have all different types of cancers later on in life. These types of attacks were considered inhumane, and because of that, they were banned. They were considered war crimes. Jumping back to Shiro, he was reading about how chemical and bioweapons were banned, and he really took big issue with this. Shiro felt like Japan needed to violate these treaties in order to ensure that Japan had the most destructive weapons at their disposal. Shiro was very committed to this idea, and he really wanted to sway some of the military leaders, but initially they just weren't biting. So Shiro decided to do a tour around the world studying chemical and biological weapons. In case you're wondering what the difference is, a biological weapon comes from a living organism, so like creating a super germ. But a chemical weapon is completely man-made, like the mustard gas we talked about. So Shiro goes on this world tour studying these weapons. Let me tell you all the places he went. Denmark, France, Finland, Germany, Canada, Belgium, Hungary, Poland, Italy, Sweden, Switzerland, Turkey, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, India, Singapore, and the US. That is a real deal world tour right there. At each stop, he would link up with local scientists and gather as much information as he could, because what he was doing was compiling all of this intelligence to take back to Japan and hopefully sway a lot of very important opinions. During his travels, Shiro became convinced that other countries were still experimenting with biological and chemical weapons, and that if Japan wanted to be able to even compete, they needed to be number one. They essentially needed to be the best at being the worst. Shiro traveled roughly 2 years before returning to Japan, and when he returned, things were very different. The people that were in power that Shiro was working so hard to convince that they needed to be developing these weapons, well, all of a sudden they were more open to hearing his ideas. They were especially interested when Shiro told them that all of the research, the testing, the development would be super, super cheap. We were in a global depression at the time, so developing more effective weapons for cheaper was basically music to the military's ears, and they threw all of their support behind Shiro. And this moment was like the catalyst to a freaking train wreck. Once Shiro had the military's support, he developed so many connections within the government. Soon he amassed this massive list of connections and friends in very high places. And it wasn't long before Shiro had convinced everyone and had everyone in agreement that Japan should break these treaties and start developing chemical and biological weapons. Shiro was also appointed chair of immunology at Tokyo Army Medical College. So now he had the military, the government, the medical, and the academic communities all under his spell. And Shiro used this to his full advantage. Once he was appointed to chair, Shiro really got to work, because with his new title, that meant he would be receiving government-funded grants. In the beginning, the research centered mostly around vaccines against chemical and biological weapons. Supposedly, all of the testing was done in petri dishes or probably on animals, because animal testing was huge back then. In my opinion, that nobody asked for, but I'm going to give it anyway, I think this is a lie, because so many countries, including the US, are very guilty of doing open air testing where they just expose people and animals to all kinds of illnesses. They could have been telling the truth, but it was just a common practice, so I'm pretty sure that they also did it, but they said it was just petri dishes and animals. Anyway, I'm assuming he saw progress because he started getting more and more funding for his experiments. Once Shiro saw that money and understood what he could actually do with it, he started to act like he just couldn't go any further with the petri dish or with testing on animals because he had just learned every possible thing that he could from them. Shiro needed more suitable subjects to test these weapons. Humans, he needed humans to test the weapons. So he started requesting people to experiment on. The Japanese military invaded China in 1931, and they were conquering these communities one by setting up a very heavy military and police presence. One of these places was called Manchuria. It was completely overrun with Japanese forces, and Shiro thought that it would be the ideal place to set up headquarters for a new testing site. So he basically started begging to be sent there and begging for this headquarters because remember, he needed to be able to test on humans. He had already brainwashed everyone into thinking that they needed these chemical and biological weapons, and now he was basically telling them, I absolutely cannot go any further without human testing, and I have the perfect place. It was eventually cleared and he was given permission to set up shop in a very small city that I'm going to put on the screen because I could not find the pronunciation. And Google kept saying to me, are you trying to say Beyonce? But this was the birth of Unit 731. This town was in a pretty secluded area and Shiro was relatively confident that he was going to be able to keep these experiments a secret. He was not. It is believed that the experiments on humans started in 1932 and the community noticed immediately that something weird was going on. Now, supposedly they were trying to keep this under wraps, but in addition to the trainloads of prisoners that were being brought into this newly built facility, the townspeople could hear screams coming from inside. And this compound was massive. It was basically laid out like a prison and it had cell blocks that could hold up to like 600 people. When the first prisoners arrived, they were well fed so that they could be at optimal health for testing. Shiro really wanted to make sure that all of these results would be on healthy individuals. The first victims were said to be Chinese laborers that actually built the facility. They were killed basically because they knew too much, and even though this project was okayed by the Japanese military and government, they knew that what they planned on doing at this facility would be seen as heinous. Once the facility was up and running, Shiro and his minions began to infect the first round of prisoners with various diseases. So I'm going to go through what they infected that first round of captives with and what it actually does to the human body. First up is glanders. Now, glanders is a disease that infects horses and donkeys. In humans, glanders causes skin lesions, respiratory problems, fever, and sepsis, which is blood infection. Next up, we have anthrax. Anthrax is primarily found in soil or grazing animals, and the symptoms of anthrax depend on which way you contract it. So there's skin contact, which will leave you with skin lesions that turn into these black ulcers. There's inhalation, which will give you flu-like symptoms, so shortness of breath, fever, fatigue. There's also gastrointestinal anthrax, and you will have severe stomach pain, nausea, vomiting, bloody stool. They also infected people with typhoid, and that spread through contaminated food and water. Typhoid would cause diarrhea, insomnia, headaches, delusion, constipation in some. Smallpox was spread to some people through contaminated people or things. And smallpox was so deadly because it caused intestinal bleeding, delirium, and kidney failure. Dysentery was spread among prisoners through contaminated food or water, causing diarrhea, fever, weight loss, upset stomach. It also caused nausea and vomiting. And Shiro brought out the big guns when it comes to this last one. He intentionally infected people with the bubonic plague. This is spread by infected fleas or rodents. The bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death, killed between 25 to 50 million Europeans in the 1300s. It caused fever, delirium, and really swollen lymph nodes that would eventually infect the bloodstream and cause death. The average prisoner at Unit 731 lasted about 30 days before they succumbed to whatever disease they were infected with. When the prisoners did pass away, they were actually taken to a separate building that was used for a crematorium. The findings of Shiro's experiments, including video footage, was compiled and sent to various government officials, and the findings were also available for doctors and educators to look at. And officially, there were no documented objections to anything that he was doing made by anyone. No objections. In 1934, a pretty significant event happened at Unit 731. A prisoner being held actually attacked his guard and escaped. Not only did he manage to escape, but he also unlocked the cell doors of every other person on his cell block. So there were about 40 of them that tried to escape the compound. They had a little help from the universe because not only were the guards drunk from some kind of celebration that they were having, but also the searchlights and the electrical fence were down because they were having a storm. It created an opportunity for them. So this was like their best chance at an escape. The prisoners made a human chain link and were climbing each other to get to the other side of the fence. Unfortunately, a lot of the prisoners weren't able to make it out. A lot of them were very weak because of what had been done to them. Out of the 40 released from their cells, only 20 prisoners actually made it out, and 8 of those were captured and killed. So only 12 actually escaped. The 12 prisoners that did escape joined the Japanese resistance, and they actually started to tell people about what was happening at Unit 731. This obviously brought in a lot of unwanted attention to Shiro and his crew, but instead of stopping or slowing down, he decided that they needed to relocate to an area where they were less likely to be detected. They ramped up security on the remaining prisoners, and they continued to do the experiments. In 1936, the Japanese army decided to join forces with Unit 731, and this caused a massive expansion. They were at this point trying to open many more Unit 731s along the Pacific Rim. These prisons were set up in Singapore, China, Thailand, the Philippines, New Guinea, and Burma, which I haven't heard of before. There were more than 6 of these experimentation camps. And let's not forget that they were kidnapping prisoners so that they could perform these experiments. While some of the subjects were actual prisoners, some of these people were just unlucky enough to run into one of the recruiters for the camps. The first Unit 731 site, the one we've been talking about this whole time, that was always the main experimentation site. A lot of the other sites didn't do this type of experimentation. A lot of them were just studying different diseases, how to prevent them or how to defend yourself against them. But this site, even though it moved around, was always the one that held the experimental people. That main camp was moved near a place called Pingfan, and it was located right near a railroad. Shiro expanded on that railroad so that it would basically run right through Unit 731's compound. He also arranged for an airport to be built on site so that there was always a steady stream of prisoners coming through to experiment on. The plane and the train coming on the property made it much easier to keep secret how many prisoners they were moving into the facility. This time they also displaced all of the local residents so that there was really no one there to hear the screams from the prisoners. This complex was even more massive than the first one. In addition to having a train and an airport, there was a breeding section that they say was for animals. It wasn't for animals. And there was housing on site for the workers. There was a school there for the children of these workers. There was a temple. There were restaurants. They had a pool. What the fuck is this? What is this? People are living their regular, ordinary lives on this property and they know what is happening there. It's just so weird. After construction was completed, they tried to rename and remarket it as the Disease Prevention and Water Supply Center. But why would those two things exist together in the same building? Nobody believed it. At this new camp, the experimentation got even worse. If you are sensitive or squeamish, this is not for you. I'm going to go into a little more detail about some of the experimentation, and it's pretty bad. It gets pretty bad. If you thought injecting people with terrible diseases and watching them suffer was the end of it, oh no, it gets so much worse. It gets so much worse.
Man, it just keeps getting worse.
Since they had so much space at this location, they decided to start having a lot more experiments outside. One way that they used their new space was that they would tie prisoners up at different distances away from a center point, and then they would drop a weapon in the center point, like a grenade or a bomb, and record how far out injuries were sustained, what type of injuries, how long it took people to die, just any damages that occurred to these victims at different distances. Prisoners were set on fire with flamethrowers just so that they could see how long it would take for prisoners to burn alive. They wanted to know what type of damage could be done by knives that were sharpened to different degrees. So they basically had everything from pretty dull to extremely sharp. They stabbed people to death, and then they recorded their findings. Prisoners were also shot with different types of ammunition to determine which ammunition was the most lethal. Some subjects were slowly bled out while others were starved. The scientists performed live dissections on some people, and this part is hard to hear, but they even did it on pregnant women at various stages of their pregnancies. Live dissection of the woman and the baby. Women and men were forcibly infected with various STDs. Normally at gunpoint, they would have intercourse with an infected person, and then the scientists would record the various stages of the disease. Sometimes scientists would remove a person's organs and stitch them back up just to see what would happen without that organ. They would do things like attach the intestines to the throat and just see what happens. Limbs were removed and attached to different places. People were thrown into pressure chambers until their eyes popped. Not even the babies were safe. These monsters would dunk babies into freezing cold water just to document the progression and the effects of hypothermia on them. This isn't even all of the experiments they did. I could go on for days and days just telling you about the terrible experiments that were done to these prisoners. But they only get worse, and you already get the picture. These people were so sick and so many people knew, and there was no documented objections. They viewed Unit 731 as a huge success, and Shiro kept acquiring more and more money from the government to keep his research going. Because of the perceived success of Unit 731, some of Shiro Ishii's experiments were used when Japan invaded China during World War II. Some of the employees of Unit 731 accompanied Japanese military to Shanghai, China, where they released fleas infected with the bubonic plague. They also poisoned the wells with typhoid and killed thousands of innocent villagers. And to top it all off, they also dropped typhoid from planes just to make sure they were thoroughly covering the whole area with chaos. It definitely worked because not only were thousands of people dying, but the ones that did survive were displaced because the government had to evict them and burn all the buildings down. They were very desperate. So desperate that they trusted Shiro's team when they set up vaccination camps. Hundreds and hundreds of people lined up to get vaccinations only to be injected with cholera. The scientists, along with the Japanese army, also infected food and water, and they would hand it to the village children in hopes that they would go home and get their parents sick. The Unit 731 scientists did this in 2 different cities before the Chinese government caught on to what was happening, but by that time there was so much devastation done. There was a planned attack, this same type of attack, on San Francisco, but before the plan could be carried out, the United States dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima that ended World War II. That is such a scary thought, that if the war did not end at that specific time, the bubonic plague could have been in San Francisco. It would have been all over the US. And in my own non-scientific opinion, that is the stupidest thing ever. If they studied the bubonic plague or the Black Death, then they would know that it is virtually impossible to contain once it gets out. Like, how would they guarantee that it wouldn't get back to Japan? It killed almost 50 million people. It just seems so careless and doing too much to be releasing plague on the world and just assuming that it's never going to get back. Their scientists did get infected with the plague. I don't remember his name because I don't care and I don't have any sympathy for him. But when they found out that he had the plague, he just became one of the prisoners at Unit 731 and they started to experiment on him. No loyalty. In spite of all the atrocities that Shiro and his men were carrying out, Japan did surrender after the drop of the atomic bomb. This put Shiro and his men in a state of panic. They knew what they were doing was a war crime and they were banking on winning the war. So they started destroying as much evidence as they possibly could. They even burned down the building and most of the evidence in 1945. Before they left, Shiro and his men gave the remaining prisoners and the non-scientist workers shots of cyanide poisoning just so that they would never be able to tell anything that happened at Unit 731. The United States became aware of Unit 731 when some Japanese prisoners were taken and they basically told what they knew. I'm sure the information was forced out of them, but either way, the United States was very interested in what Japan was doing. Shiro and the other scientists admitted to a very low level of experimentation, and they remained pretty tight-lipped until the United States threatened to let Russia deal with them for their war crimes. Russia was known to be pretty harsh, so they ended up complying. I'm sure there are things that happened that no one would admit to, but according to them, they were going to give full transparency. Their compliance did not come cheap though. In order for them to comply, they wanted one thing, and that was full immunity. This is hard because obviously no one that did the things that they did deserve immunity. They deserve the greatest of suffering. However, the alternative is not knowing what kind of weapons they have. Or they could sell that information to another country like Russia. Not knowing how advanced their biological or chemical weapons were, not knowing what type of experiments they were doing, the United States just could not accept that, so they did end up giving them full immunity in exchange for information. Shiro and his men did stand trial for their war crimes, but it was reported that the judges were intentionally misled by US prosecutors. They apparently gave the judges this really watered down version of what happened and made it just seem like it was so minuscule when in actuality it was horrendous. I'm assuming the prosecutor's loyalty was purchased, because why else would you do that? After Shiro Ishii was granted immunity, he went back home and retired. It's important to remind you that this was after World War II, when the Yazidis, because I don't think I can say that word on YouTube, when they were actually standing trial for their war crimes. Shiro Ishii and his friends got full immunity. Shiro died in 1959 from throat cancer, and I personally hope it was horrific. Let me know in the comments what enraged you the most about this case. For me, it's the fact that Shiro Ishii actually went home, retired with his family and friends by his side. It was said that he always had visitors. People would always stop by and praise him for his genius. His daughter was so devoted to him, even in his death. He hit the lottery and he was a freaking horrid human. I can only hope that he gets reincarnated as a dung beetle or a blade of grass that never gets watered. Because he didn't get karma in this lifetime, that's for sure. If you would like to see more of me or my special effects makeup, give this video a like and subscribe, and I will see you down another rabbit hole.